In 1492, a king and a queen sent a sailor west looking for gold. Not freedom. Gold. They wanted spices and a shorter road to get rich, and they would have laughed in your face if you told them what they were really starting. Because 250 years later, off the far edge of the land that sailor stumbled into, a people stood up and said out loud that every soul is made equal and made free by God Himself. And greater still, the gospel of Christ took root on these shores and reached souls who would have found it no other way. None of that was on the manifest. So how on earth do you get from a treasure hunt to that? You don't. Not on purpose. But the Lord has a way of taking what men mean for themselves and bending it towards something they never dreamed. That is not just how this country began. That, right there, is the whole story.
Well, hello, and come on in. I'm Grandma Rita.
And I'm Papa. We're glad you're here. Truly.
This year, our country turns 250 years old. And instead of a lecture about it, we thought we'd do what families used to do of an evening. Sit down, read a little, and talk it over.
Rita and I have been reading things out loud to each other for more years than she'll let me admit to. Here's the one thing I'd ask of you before we start. We're going to hold two things together that folks most always pull apart. Real gladness for this country, and no apology for it, and plain honesty about it, the hard parts and all. A love that can't bear the truth is just sentiment, and truth told without love is only meanness in a Sunday coat. We aim to give you both.
Both. That's the part that matters.
250 years is a long time for any nation to keep a promise. On the 4th of July, 1776, a small group of men in Philadelphia put their names to a document that made a claim larger than themselves, larger than their generation, and larger, it would turn out, than their own conduct. They wrote that all men are created equal, and that the rights every person holds are not granted by any king or Congress, but given by God. Then they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to make the claim stand, knowing that if they failed, every name on the page was a confession of treason.
There's a whole preface there, what the book is and what it isn't, how to read it. We'll let you and yours read that part together. But hear how it ends.
By the last page, the aim is simple, that you would close the book loving the fourth more honestly than before, seeing both its glory and its wounds, and wanting in your own home and your own time to live up to the promise that was made 250 years ago. That promise was never finished. It was handed forward. It is just now in your hands. And He made from one man every nation of mankind to inhabit all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for Him and find Him, though He is not far from each one of us. Acts 17:26 and 27.
Read it slowly, and read it together. I love that's how it was meant to be used.
So let's do the first chapter just that way. It's called The Roots, and the idea is simple. A great tree don't show up the day you notice it. By the time it's tall enough to sit under, its roots have been working in the dark for a lifetime.
The country was declared in one summer.
But it grew for 100 years before that. 4 things grew together. Let's take them one at a time. a people who could govern themselves. The most important thing about the men and women who settled the northern colonies is what they believed about authority. They were the children of the Reformation, people who had learned to read the Bible for themselves and to answer to God directly. And a person who has learned to stand before God on his own conscience is not easily told that his worship or his life must be dictated by a distant power. In 1620, a small company of these people, the Pilgrims, landed on the wrong coast. They had crossed the ocean to escape a church that told them how to worship, and a storm had carried them to a place where no English law reached them, and no governor held any authority over them at all. They could have dissolved into every man for himself on a freezing shore. Instead, before they went ashore, they did something quietly remarkable. They wrote and signed the Mayflower Compact, binding themselves together into a civil body and promising to make and obey just and equal laws for the common good. Ordinary people, by their own act, on their own authority under God, chose the rules they would live under, rather than waiting to receive them from a crown across the sea. That winter killed nearly half of them. The survivors buried their dead, and when the Mayflower sailed home that spring, not one of them was aboard. 10 years later, the Puritans planted Massachusetts Bay, and their leader, John Winthrop, told them what kind of community they were to be. They would be, he said, as a city upon a hill, watched by the world and answerable to God. Out of that covenant faith grew a covenant politics, the town meeting, the self-governing congregation, a whole people in the habit of holding themselves to a law higher than their own wishes. The single most consequential idea in early American life was planted here, that legitimate authority rests on the consent of a people who answer to God. One hard truth belongs beside that achievement. The same people who crossed an ocean for the freedom to follow their own conscience did not, once they held power, grant that freedom to others. A dissenter in Massachusetts Bay could be fined, banished, or worse. They had learned that conscience answers to God and not to the state, and they had not yet learned to extend that mercy to the neighbor who read God differently. Liberty claimed only for oneself is half learned, and the New World would take the better part of 2 centuries to finish the lesson. That first winter killed near half of them. Half. And come spring, when the Mayflower weighed anchor and sailed home to England, not one of them was aboard. Not one. They had buried their own in that frozen ground, and still not a soul climbed back on that ship.
I keep thinking about the mothers. You don't bury your own child in a strange, cold place and then stay, Papa, over an idea. You stay because you believe all the way down that the God you crossed the ocean for is worth it, and that He's holding your baby now. That isn't history to me. That's faith doing the hardest thing it will ever be asked to do.
Yeah, that's the part I'd have read right past. A law above the king. The settlers carried something else across the ocean, a long English tradition that no ruler stands above the law. For centuries, Englishmen had insisted that the king himself was bound by ancient rites and customs, and that a power which broke them had broken faith. By the colonial era, this conviction had a great teacher in William Blackstone, whose writings the founders read closely. Blackstone taught that human law has no authority of its own when it contradicts the law of nature and the revealed law of God, and that the whole purpose of government is to secure the rights people already possess. That last point is the hinge of everything. The colonists did not think of their liberties as gifts the government handed down and could take back. They thought of them as theirs already, held under God, and the government's one job was to protect them. When London later began to tax and command them without their consent, they did not feel they were asking for something new. They felt they were defending something old that was being stolen.
So when London started taxing them, they didn't feel they were asking for something new.
No, they felt something old was being stolen. That right there is the hinge of everything that comes after. A virtue without which freedom dies. The colonists had also drunk from an older well, the wisdom of Greece and Rome about what a self-governing people requires. The ancient republics had taught a sobering lesson. Liberty does not run on good intentions. A free people must be a virtuous people, willing to put the common good above private appetite, or its freedom rots from the inside, and it hands itself over to whoever promises order. You cannot keep a republic with selfish citizens. The founders knew this, quoted it, and feared it, and it is one of the quiet warnings woven through everything they built. Scripture had said the same thing more plainly, and the colonists knew that too. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people. Proverbs 14:34.
You cannot keep a republic with selfish citizens. That's really a teaching problem, isn't it? Virtue's not automatic. It has to be raised into a child, day after day.
It does, and that more than almost anything is the work of every mother and father watching. A free people has to be a virtuous people, or its freedom rots from the inside. That's not a subject you can skip. It's the whole reason we teach the way we do. The fire that made one people. For all of that, the 13 colonies were still 13 separate places, founded at different times by different people for different reasons, with little sense of belonging to one another. What first knit them together was not a war or a law, it was a revival. In the 1730s and 1740s, a great spiritual awakening swept the colonies. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards and the tireless George Whitefield pressed one insistent message on rich and poor alike, that a person must be born again, and that the new birth is a work God does, not a ceremony a church performs. Do not marvel that I said to you, you must be born again. John 3:7. The message leveled people. It told the respectable churchgoer and the frontier farmer the same thing, that belonging to a church and being made new by God were not the same, and that no one could earn the second. And because it crossed every colonial and denominational line at once, carried by preaching that ordinary people could weigh against their own Bibles, it gave the colonies their first shared experience. For the first time, a man in Georgia and a man in Massachusetts had lived through the same thing together. A people cannot easily act as one until it has first felt itself to be one, and the revival is where that feeling began. The connection to what came later should be stated at exactly its true strength, and no more. The awakening did not cause the revolution. It shaped the soil from which the revolution would grow. It taught ordinary colonists to read for themselves, to judge even a famous preacher against the truth, and to answer to God before they answered to any earthly authority. A people in that habit of mind is not easily told it has no rights its rulers are bound to respect. A generation later, that would matter a great deal. The roots were now deep, a self-governing faith, a law above the king, a sober knowledge that freedom needs virtue, and a fresh sense of being one people under God. The tree was ready. All it needed was a storm to make it stand. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Matthew 5:14.
It wasn't a war or a law that first made them one people. It was a revival.
A people had to feel itself one before it could ever act as one, and what gave them that was every soul, rich and poor, hearing the same word, you must be born again, the same ground, level under God. The tree was ready. All it needed now was a storm to make it stand. The book closes the chapter with something to sit with. It reaches back more than 1,000 years to Augustine, writing about empires that were already dust in his day. He said, "God gives kingly power on earth, both to the pious and the impious, as it may please him, whose good pleasure is always just."
Empire's long gone, and it still lands on this one.
It lands on every nation that ever rose. The land was here. The peoples were here. The timing that brought a Bible-reading people to an open continent was never theirs to arrange. We started tonight with a king chasing gold, and what came of it was something he never aimed at.
God bending the purposes of men toward ends they never intended.
From the first page to the last. And that's the only frame you can love this country honestly inside of. Not because it was righteous, but because the one who rules the nations was at work in it. As the psalm says it, "For the kingdom is Yahweh's, and he rules over the nations." Psalms 22:28.
That takes the weight off somehow. We don't have to pretend the founders were saints to be grateful for what God did through them.
No, and we don't have to look away from their sins either. Both can be true.
They closed this chapter with a hymn from 1829, a young nation's prayer of gratitude, and at the very end, a plea to be kept in the fear of God. We'll leave you with its words.
Great God, preserve us in thy fear. In danger still our guardian be. O spread thy truth's bright precepts here. Let all the people worship thee. That's the first route. Next time, the storm that made the tree stand. The road to independence.
And the whole book is yours, free. Go to GraceHaven.ai, and in the free resources library, you can read it in your browser or download a copy to print.
Sign up and we'll send the download link straight to your inbox and keep you posted as the rest of the series comes out before the 4th.
And with the reason behind teaching faith and virtue and history together is the education you want for your children or grandchildren, that's exactly what GraceHaven Academy is built to do. First link in the description.
Thank you for sitting with us. We're glad you were here.